Welcome to our Block 5 CC conversation. As you may already know, this academic year marks the 50th anniversary of the Block Plan, which was implemented in the 1970-1971 academic year. Since its founding, the Block Plan has distinguished Colorado College and draws students from across the state of Colorado, the nation, and the world. Today, we are joined by Professor Emerita of History and current Chair for Economics and Business, Susan Ashley, and Associate Professor of English, Chair of the English Department, and Director of the Journalism Institute at CC, Steven Hayward, who have been collaborating over the past 3 years to commemorate the Block Plan's golden anniversary. Professor Ashley joined CC in 1970 when the Block Plan began, and she has authored a book documenting the history of the Block Plan titled The Block Plan, an Unrehearsed Educational Venture. Professor Hayward is writer and co-director of a documentary film about the Block Plan. We launched both the book and film on February 14th and have a series of virtual talkback discussions running through March. There is so much you can say about both Professor Ashley and Professor Hayward. I've had the opportunity to work with both of them. I just want to let all of you know they are so dedicated and committed to this community, and they certainly are dedicated and committed to our students.
Susan, I'm eager and anxious to hear about your efforts researching and writing your book. What did the process entail, and could you give us some highlights of what you found enjoyable in this process?
The process has been both familiar and unfamiliar to me. Familiar because as an historian, I've spent hours and hours, days and days in the archives trying to reconstruct some set of events, usually having to do with 19th and early 20th century in France and in Italy. This was much like that in some ways. You reconstruct events and you try to draw from those events some sort of a story or narrative. You rely on the recorded record, and that means you rely on what's there. You can't really supply the record. You have to take what randomly appears. So in the case of CC, you would think CC would be quite organized and methodical in its construction of its archives and the preservation of its history. But that is simply not so. I found that certain offices left their records. Some did not. Individuals thought fit to save some of the things that recorded kinds of things they did. I will cite in particular David Finley, who saved every last scrap of paper. He annotated every mimeograph or Xerox instruction that he ever received. And he thought fit to leave that to the college. And so his papers are in special collections, and I found them extremely useful. But then there are enormous gaps. There are things that you wish somebody had thought would be worth preserving down the road, but they didn't. And then there's some things which have basically nothing to do with anything, yet they turn out to be quite valuable. The research took place in special collections, but I also, because I had an inside track on this, knew that the dean's office had never left anything in special collections. It's all stored in a cage, the cage, down in the basement of Armstrong, the same with the registrar's office. And it has no order whatsoever. I think Steve can attest to that because he accompanied me every once in a while down there, and you simply went through all kinds of boxes and files, which were helter-skelter behind these iron bars. So it was a familiar process to me when it comes to the recorded record. But what was unfamiliar to me was being able to hear people's voices. And so we came upon tapes, and I think Steve is going to talk a little bit about that later, various tapes that people had saved or not saved. We looked very hard for a critical tape, which should have existed, but we have never found. And I think both of us are still confident that one day it will turn up. And then there were the oral histories of the college, which were compiled until about from maybe 1970s to 1995 by Tutt Library under the direction of Judy Finley. And those were absolutely invaluable. I have no idea why it is that people would actually answer her questions in the way that they did. She would ask questions and they would come up with things that they never should have told anybody. And so those turned out to be a rich trove of information about the block plan and the history of the college. And then, and this was absolutely unfamiliar to me, I had never been able to talk with anybody who was the subject of my research because they were long dead. And so that personal aspect was completely missing generally in the sorts of things I usually do. And so I got to talk again to people about the block plan, people that with whom I'd been colleagues over the years, and find out what happened when I wasn't there. Finally, the last thing about the process, which was really unusual and I found very hard to navigate, was the fact that I was part of the history that I was writing. And in fact, sometimes I was a protagonist. And I found it really uncomfortable unwinding the narrator and actor dichotomy. And so you will find in the book that I refer to every other dean than myself. If you want to know what I was doing in the time, you have to look in the footnotes. But I found that really difficult. And then because of that, the other source for this was my memory. Because I came after the block plan was developed, so I have no memory at all of how it came to be. But I certainly have memories of how it is that it is and was. The trouble with that was, this was one of the most astonishing and disconcerting parts of my research, was how little I remembered, even of the things in which I was the most central character. And then there were other things which I had experienced and found inexplicable. And I discovered some of the reasons why those things had happened. So the process was, as you can imagine, it was a very personal and also a very intriguing and fascinating one. And I owe a lot to the people with whom I worked. I had two wonderful student research assistants, and then the help of people in the library. And in fact, the help of a kind of a odd person who said, well, you want the key to the cage, well, I'll give it to you. You don't have to come ask, you can have it forever. And so I do. I can go into the archives anytime I please. But I will return it soon. So what did I learn from this? Well, I learned something I'd never known, and that was how it is that a college can embrace a completely different system. And I found that fascinating because I'm interested as a scholar in change and in the politics of change. I had never realized how close the block plan came to failing. Our story is that it took root and it flourished. But in fact, there were times of real danger. And I think the people who were there at the time were pretty convinced that had certain decisions not been made, we would have returned to some other system or invented another one. So I didn't know about that. And I would say that if I were, you said, what would a takeaway from this be? The thing I can't stop thinking about was this extraordinarily ingenious question, which drove the whole master planning process, which led to the block plan. They asked a particular question then, and we have not asked that question in that way since. And I'm quite convinced that we should consider asking the same question once again. The question was, how is it that we can do what we do better? And it was a question which was asked of the entire institution. And it ended up focusing on the academic realm. But the question was ingenious because they knew what they were doing. And what they were doing was offering a liberal arts education to their students. It was a time when other institutions were abandoning the liberal arts and moving much more toward vocational instruction. So they felt a general and genuine commitment to the liberal arts. And so they asked themselves how they could do that better. Later on, we started to ask the question, how can we be better? Which is a relative question, relative to perfection and relative to other institutions. They didn't ask either one of those, and they didn't seem to care. But they did care about doing what they do better. And so in terms of a takeaway, I think that would be one of the major ones. And the second one is the degree to which random serendipitous things mattered in the shaping of the block plan. That, along with some very particular personalities who are largely responsible, I think, for developing the idea and then seeing that other people embraced it, or enough other people to make it a go. So that there's a bit of the internal story of this.
That's the block plan book coming to you can get it on the website.
Yeah.
You can go ahead, click through, and you too can take a copy of this home.
I'll even sign it for you if you tell me to.
I'll even sign it for you. Professor Ashley will sign it for a fee.
Not for a fee.
So, Steven, let's talk a little bit about the film, about the approach you took. I understand it focuses as much on the present of the college as it does on the past. And Professor Ashley has given us this teaser about some tapes, so we want to hear the story of the tapes. What do you have to tell us?
Yeah, just to say a little bit about the documentary, that we wanted to tell the founding of the plan, the story of 1969, 1970. We wanted to tell that story, how the block plan came to be, but we wanted to tell it in a way that also showed the way that the block plan exists today and the way that it exists in the present as the lived reality for the faculty, staff, and students of the college. And we were really not interested in making a strictly historical document, but rather one that assessed, that took a real, I think, honest and sometimes really hard look at the college, that shows it some of its high points, some of its great moments, and also some of its toughest moments. Some of the moments when it's tested, most facing very difficult questions. And so that was what that's the approach. We follow students, we follow faculty as they go through a year. We interview people who are at the college right now. President Edmonds is one of our stars of the film, and an important voice in the film, just as he is in the college's history. And so it's that kind of approach. In terms of the tapes, Robert, thank you for asking. It was very, when you start on a project like this, I don't want to say the last thing that you think is that you will ever find anything, add anything to the archive. Although one of the things we wanted to do in this project was to expand the archive into the present. We did a lot of interviews of really important figures in the past and the present of the college that will go in their entirety into the archive. But we knew coming into it, I shouldn't say coming into it, very early on, Professor Ashley drew to my attention these moments. And, you'll have to wade a little bit into the block plan history to notice these moments when Glenn Brooks is taping things. There's he tells in the story of the founding of the block plan. He says he had this idea for unified learning, and he set aside some time to lay it out to then president of the college, Lou Warner, dean of the college, George Drake, behind a closed door session, which he taped. And we saw he's written about that, spoke about it in many instances, and we saw that, and we thought, oh, that would be the thing that we would really want to find. That tape is tape. That was what Susan was referring to. That is the sort of block plan equivalent of Shakespeare's foul papers, the rough draft of Shakespeare before it goes to the printer. That's the sort of holy grail of Shakespeare studies. In block plan studies, it's that tape where where Professor Brooks pitches the block plan for the first time. There's another moment later on in which Glenn Brooks is at a faculty meeting, which he's taping, and he is, they stop the meeting and say, Professor Brooks, shut off that tape. And so we knew, in other words, that Professor Brooks had a tape recorder in 1968, 1969, 1970, and that he was using it. And so we thought there must be some tapes out there. And one of the people who we were talking to, Susan mentioned Special Collections, was Jesse Randall and Amy Brooks, both of whom were working at Special Collections. We did a lot of work with them. And so there was one afternoon, I was down at Special Collections. I said to Amy, I know you're going through your father's stuff. Glenn Brooks is now 88 years old. I know you're going through stuff. You're figuring out what you're going to give to the Colorado College archive. You're going to figure out what doesn't go to the archive. That's a particular kind of conversation. I said, if you find any tapes, I'm not sure if they're going to be cassette tapes. I'm not sure if they're going to be big reel-to-reel tapes. I didn't think they were going to be 8 tracks, but I say, if it's if you find anything that looks like a tape, please let me know. And I remember Amy was quite skeptical. She said, I doubt it. Sure enough, she found 2 audio. These are a set of tapes, about, there are 2 or 3 sets of cassette tapes, old, sort of 60-minute tapes, which you'd have to sort of turn over, and record the other side of it. The first of them is a recording of the Fall Faculty Conference of 1969, when the faculty gathered as a whole and debated and talked about the block plan for the first time as a whole. Glenn Brooks recorded that. And then the other, and this is when Susan mentions that, things that you think would be in the archive that aren't in the archive. One of probably the most important audio document that we found and that now are restoring to the archive is the recording of the fall convocation of 1969, when Professor Brooks laid out the block plan. He then called it the master plan, or the all college plan, to the students of the college for the first time in Shove Chapel. No, we haven't heard that recording for 50 years. And to find that document, such a pivotal document in the college's history, that was one of the real thrills of working on this project. And that's why we, in addition to the book and in addition to the documentary film, we've put together a podcast, because we really thought it was important to capture some aspect of this history in an audio form particularly. And, while you sort of say to people, you can access that document in its entirety if you go to the archive, hardly anyone goes to an archive to access any document in its. I realize how much of an English professor I am. Go to the archive; you'll love it. So we thought we needed to come at the history through audio, and for that we did use a lot of the oral history, a very underutilized resource at the college. Is the oral histories, and in the podcast you can hear voices of people in the college's history that have been gone for some time. You hear Lou Warner talk about the block plan for the first time. You hear a former chair of the English department, Neil Reinitz, make the strange and probably unsupportable claim that Lou Warner came up with the idea of the block plan. It's really interesting to hear those voices. We go all the way back to 1955 in that. So anyway, it was exciting to find that, though. That's for sure.
Susan and Steven, you both have taught here for a long time. I'd love to know your thoughts about what are the pros and cons of the block plan. All of us here have committed ourselves to it. But of course, we know that some things work better than others, and I'd love to hear your perspectives.
You want me to start?
Sure.
Well, I'm not really a very good authority on anything other than the block plan because I've only taught briefly with semesters, and as a student, I was on trimesters for the most part. I think the most important thing about the block plan is not the block plan. It's the fact that what accompanied it was the decision to limit class size, all classes to 25. And so I don't think you can look at the one without the other. I mean, the block plan, if it had been with the type of small classes, large lecture classes that are typical in other institutions, simply would not have had the same effect that it did with a class size of 25, which, by the way, was entirely arbitrary. There was nothing pedagogical about that decision to have 25, to cap them at 25. It was what they could do at the time. They really wanted to get to the average student-faculty ratio, which was around 13 or so. The small size of all classes is, I think, a tremendous strength of our system. Another thing about the block plan, which they knew about when they started or they thought would happen, was the cultivation of much more collaboration among students and between faculty and students. And that happened immediately and has really never stopped happening. And I think whereas in other institutions, small classes can cultivate that, it's drawn out over a longer period. In this context, it's daily and intense and immersive. I think that another strength of the block plan is the possibility that you can actually live your courses. I haven't always found that a pleasant experience when I teach 20th century Europe and I'm in the Nazi period and have to worry about whether the soap is real in the shower. I would just as soon have distracting subjects, but it is an incomparable thing to day after day be talking about essential questions with the same group of students without distraction. So that for me is a real plus. And then the obvious plus, I think, is another obvious plus is that you can leave campus. You can leave campus for a block, a week, a few days. You can leave for a few hours. And that happens elsewhere, but it doesn't happen as easily as it does here. You don't have that competition of other obligations as a general rule. So that's been a real strength of it. I think another strength has been the block plan has always attracted a certain kind of student, and just a little bit off kilter, a little bit creative, a little bit risky, a little bit daring, not intimidated by having a class where you can be seen across the table. And that I think has really made teaching under the block plan an inimitable experience. As to the weaknesses of the block plan, I think there are two. One is its strength. It's also weakness, and that's its intensity for faculty members. That has from the very beginning always been an issue. They thought they were gaining control of time, and within a few months after they established the block plan, they realized that they had actually lost control of time again. But the other thing about the block plan, which is, I think, both a strength and a weakness, and they realized it right away. They hadn't anticipated it, but it happened. And that is that people began to create classes which were tailored to the block plan, which means specialized topics-oriented classes. And you could watch the surveys vanish. And so not to have that balance of specialized courses and general courses, I think, is one of the substantive downsides of the plan. But I, as a teacher, wouldn't trade the block plan for anything.
I think that one of the things that I was struck by is that many of the questions that we ask about the block plan, many of the criticisms of the block plan, the stress of that Susan mentioned, both on students and in faculty, the way in which the Colorado College, the way in which the block plan has built into it a block break that is, social, economic inequality is a huge issue on campuses across the country. Not every campus calendar, though, has a block break built into it that underscores precisely those inequalities. And those are questions that we're asking ourselves now. Those are things that we're doing something about now. But it was a question in 1969 when the faculty debated the block plan for the first time. I remember interviewing Professor Hockman, who was one of the people who we lost during the filming of it. We really had the feeling that we needed to get going on this project because many of the people we wanted to interview were of advanced years and sometimes in very fragile health. I remember Professor Hockman said to me, well, I was worried about the block breaks because if you had a car, you had a car. And if you didn't, you didn't. And that is a really succinct way of saying, and I think that as an institution, one of the real strides that we have made in recent years, and we cover this in the film, is about addressing exactly those inequities and what can we do as a campus to make Colorado College more inclusive and more accessible. And so I think that's striking to me, that we still like the way in which the block plan is structured that invites continual critique and improvement. It's not a settled thing. It's really is. And I guess that's the case around the semester, but I don't know that everybody who's teaching on a semester system says to themselves, are we doing this semester in exactly the way that we should? Could we make the semester better? I've taught at semester schools, and I don't think that there's a deep interrogation of that going on as frequently or with the kind of intensity that we do at Colorado College. Combine that with the block plan schedule, which allows us to not only see the change that needs to be made, but to do it and to put it into action immediately. I think that's both a criticism of the block plan, but also an advantage of it. I often say to students, what we need to get away from is some platonic idea of education. Is it the best? Is it the worst? What is it? We need to think about who you are as a student and if it's the right thing for you. I don't advocate, spaghetti sauce with mushrooms in it. If you want mushrooms in your spaghetti sauce, you should get that kind of sauce. But if you don't like mushrooms, if your idea of being in class is to be one of 250 students sequestered away in the back of the room, hoping that no one notices you or that you don't have to contribute to the discussion, Colorado College is not for you. But if you're the kind of person who wants to be in a class that not only will ask much of you, but that you can ask much of, then come to Colorado College. For me, I say this always to students, you're on, like, if you're taking 4 courses at a time, you're taking 5 courses at a time, you're becoming very shrewd about what you're spending your time on. Your courses are things to get through rather than into. And at Colorado College, because you're taking one class, the block plan is like not a complicated idea. One class at a time. If you're taking one class at a time, you can invest in that class and that investment will be repaid. And I think for me, what I teach creativity, right? I teach writing. And I don't know of another way of approaching the craft of writing, the endeavor that means the most to me, that's better than the block plan. Yes, when you see by the way, I should say, full disclosure, when you see me in the movie, Robert, what you'll see in me is I enter in Steven Hayward, professor of English, block plan enthusiast. And that's true. I am a block plan enthusiast. Like Susan, I am somebody who loves teaching on the block plan, and there's no other place that I would rather be. So yeah, I'm not impartial about this. I think it really is I don't know if it's good for everything. I know it's good for what I do, particularly in my classroom.
Well, I do have one more question I want to ask you two enthusiasts, and that's about the future. Where do you think we go from here? Steven, you've talked about change. Susan, you've posed a major question we could ask ourselves. So I'd like to hear from each of you about where you think we're headed.
I'll just say, I believe that the block plan is a way, a mode of curriculum delivery that technology has caught up with. I think that one of the things that we are going to see in a post-COVID world, now not everything will stay. We will come back to campus and we will resume life on the Colorado College campus, but we will retain from the experience of the present moment some aspect of understanding exactly how flexible, how expansive we can make our classrooms through technology, and the ways in which that is particularly true of the schools that are on the block plan. I think there's a flexibility to the block plan that lends itself to the technological, to the digital. And I think that's only just emerging right now. I don't know where, but I think that one of the things that I'm looking forward to seeing in the next 10, 20 years is the way in which the digital block plan becomes something that we understand in its full complexity and potential.
Yeah, I would agree with that. There's something about an outside crisis which can shake things up. There was no outside crisis that forced the block plan. When you read about the architects of the block plan, one of the things they were convinced would not happen, but feared might, was that the block plan would lapse into a kind of orthodoxy. It would become orthodox in the same way that semesters did. Lou Warner, when he was talking to a reporter from the Rocky Mountain News, said, if this turns into another rigid system, we will get rid of it immediately. And then he used his Missouri accent to say it would be god awful if we just got stuck in the block plan. We can't keep the block plan for any longer than is absolutely necessary. I mean, they really imagined that their capacity to change would be an enduring one. So they feared a relapse into educational orthodoxy. And then those who felt that the block plan would change with the times also worried, but they worried about something different. They worried about it adapting and losing its soul. And so when you look at where it started and where it is now, there's no question but that it lapsed into an orthodoxy. There's no question but that it's iconic. There's no question but that it's an institution, not an idea, not a prospect, not an experiment. I mean, and it is very rigid. If you compare now to then, there's so much flexibility in structure and options that we've lost. Did the block plan adapt? It did. It did change. It changed and probably lasted because it was capable of changing. The fundamentals are still there, one course at a time, immersive, intensive learning, small groups, highly collaborative and interactive. Those things have lasted. And if those things are the soul of the block plan, then it hasn't lost its soul. Will it continue into the future? I see no reason why it won't, but I'm not sure I see any reason why it should. But it is a system that so far works.
Before we conclude, I just want to say that in terms of, we've been working on this project for a long time. I've been working on this film for a long time. And I just want to acknowledge that, in this, this real collaboration that Susan has been an invaluable, it's been great to work with her. She's taught me so much about the block plan, but also about how to approach research and how to see a story. And I also want to say that as we were making the block plan documentary, a really key interlocutor for me at a very key late moment in making this film was President Edmonds, who saw an early version of the film, or on almost, when we were just about, there, and gave extraordinarily detailed notes, but also spent literally hours talking through the documentary with me, and then contributed to it at a really complicated moment when we were in the midst of the pandemic. And I just want to acknowledge the debt of thanks that I owe to you, President Edmonds, for taking the time and taking this project, giving it your attention with the seriousness that you did. And I want to thank you personally.
I could turn this back at you, Steve. It's been a trip to work with someone who has such an overactive imagination.
Well, on that note, Susan and Steve, it's so great to see both of you again. It's really exciting. I can't wait until we're able to see each other on campus. As you know, I've always enjoyed working with both of you and excited to do so as we continue to talk about the future of the block plan. Thank you for the book. Thank you for the podcast. Thank you for the film. Wow, thank you for this conversation. It's just been, it's been a highlight. What a joy this past 45 minutes has really been. And I just want to encourage all of us in the CC community, read the book, watch the film, get involved with the podcast, but also have a great block break.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
So that's take one. Now we'll go back and say,